I woke up feeling warm and well rested. A sense of deep contentment welled up within me and extended to every part of my being. I yawned like a big, fat, contented cat and aimlessly rolled out of bed to see what the morning had to offer. Pleasant, soothing memories of the previous day lingered on, of the flight from Glasgow to Barra to meet the hermit Peter Calvé. But when I opened the curtains, I was greeted by a dull, doleful day. Heavy dark clouds seemed to cling around everything in sight. The clammy Hebridean mist scarcely disguised a gentle but relentless drizzle that made even the stones look soggy. I'd made myself a cup of coffee and went back to bed. It would be several hours before I met the hermit for the first time at the 11 o'clock mass, so I picked up the book that I was reading on the plane and began to read about the early Franciscans. I became so lost in reading the book that I almost missed my first meeting with Peter. And then I was so distracted that it was only after he'd gone that I was able to reflect on the man whom I'd come to see. Firstly, I was shocked to find that Peter had a serious disability. As I found out later, he'd suffered from polio since the age of 6. His left leg never grew again, and so he had to wear a built-up boot and an iron caliper, and he always used a walking stick. Secondly, I'd misread him completely. This was my own fault. I was forever building up people's characters on too little evidence. I just assumed that Peter would be so jealous of his privacy, his past, his way of life, and his solitude, that he would have placed no entry signs everywhere about his person. He certainly wasn't garrulous. Nobody could accuse him of that. But I had the distinct impression that he was completely transparent, had no secrets at all, and was prepared to talk in a simple, unaffected way about himself or anything else for that matter. There was a hardly definable something about him that gently exuded tranquility and peace. But having said this, I've said all I can say to convey my first impressions. After our first tete-a-tete, talking about nothing in particular, Peter suddenly looked at his watch and said, "Sorry, James, but I really do have to go. I've got several things to do before nightfall, so would you please excuse me? I'll see you tomorrow about 11 o'clock, if that's all right." "That'll be fine," I agreed. "I'll look forward to seeing you then." The scales that had been obscuring my vision for the last 6 months were gradually beginning to fall from my eyes, and I was able to see more clearly. What I began to see and began to realize was that my little dream had come to an end. I'd no doubt about his sincerity, or his honest-to-God Christian piety and goodness for that matter. It was obvious. He had not tried to deceive me or anyone else for that matter. He'd made his position plain before I even came to the Isles. He was, of course, quite right. How could he possibly understand what I'd been going through? How could a man who separated himself so completely from the modern world possibly have any idea of the psychological strain and inner conflicts of faith that modern world placed on a layman like me? But, thank God, I was making another mistake. This man, I was soon to learn, was a mystic in the literal and fullest sense of the word. His knowledge was the knowledge that only comes from experience. That is why when he began to speak about the spiritual life, he would speak with a confidence and a conviction that would leave me in no doubt at all that here indeed was a man who spoke with authority. I had no objection to meeting him again. However, I could no longer see the point or the desirability of spending 2 hours a day talking to him about topics of importance to me, which would be outside the range of his experience, and hence his understanding. However, I wanted to avoid appearing rude or embarrassing. I didn't want to embarrass him in any way at all. So I hid my feelings behind a smokescreen of vague generalizations about the spiritual poverty of the contemporary world. Feigning bewilderment, I asked him what he thought the recipe is for escaping from the moral morass in which we all find ourselves today. Love, Peter answered, simulating sincerity and thinking that one good cliché deserves another. I agreed and said, yes, if only we could love one another consistently. Oh, I'm not talking about our love, Peter replied, with a sudden directness that took me by surprise. I'm talking about the love of God, or if you like, the spiritual energy and power for good that continually surges out of the Creator, as it has done from the very beginning. When I retorted that in my darkest moments after losing my wife and child, I no longer believed in God, never mind his so-called love, I asked him what could be done for someone who believes in nothing. When a person is totally depressed, as you were, Peter said, it's not the time for philosophizing. It's the time for giving human support and compassion while encouraging a person to seek appropriate medical attention. But you're not in the pit now, are you, James? If you were, you wouldn't be here now. So I suppose I could give you a philosophical answer if you want one. Yes, please, I said. I did want an answer because I was still having moments when I thought that there is no God and there never was one, and that there is just nothing out there. Then Peter began to speak. If there was ever a time when there was simply nothing, no thing whatsoever, then we couldn't possibly be here now, nor could everybody else, nor could the world around us. In short, something cannot come from nothing, said Peter. Let me explain. When I was only 9 years of age, I learnt my first lesson in philosophy, thanks to the conjurer at my friend's party. I was chosen to examine the inside of his top hat, to prove that there was nothing in it. Then he draped everything in sight with silk handkerchiefs, flags, and bouquets of flowers. When I told my father what I'd seen, he said the conjurer could not possibly have taken something out of nothing. If there was nothing in the hat, then nothing could come out of it. There was either something hidden inside it that I hadn't seen, or something hidden up the conjurer's sleeve. My father wasn't a spoilsport. He was just trying to teach me something that I've never forgotten. Something cannot come from nothing. The Big Bang, or whatever else brought the universe into being, cannot have been preceded by nothing. It must have been preceded by something. However, no matter how sophisticated it might be, something cannot produce the highest form of energy for good on earth, which is love. Whatever was responsible for creation, therefore, must be someone. Only a person can produce love. No thing or nothing cannot generate the greatest power for good on earth, namely love. That is why the Gospel states quite clearly that God, in whom and by whom all things were created, is love. That's what he was, that's what he is, and that's what he does. So I suppose it'd be more accurate to say that God is not so much love, but loving, continually bursting with creative life and energy. Love is but the word we use to describe the most potent form of power and energy on earth, which can alone change people permanently for the better. Nothing else can, nothing else ever will. There was a brief moment of silence before Peter continued. I had a cousin called John who was a bit of a rake. Peter wasn't smiling. He pursed his lips together, slightly nodding his head, as if the memory of the incident he was about to relate still brought back painful memories. We had all given up on him when things dramatically changed. It was almost as if he had a conversion experience, being struck by an angel of light or something heavy. Then, after a few weeks, he arrived home with a tiny Korean nurse called Nina, whom he'd met at a party. She was nothing to look at, quite plain in fact, but he was hopelessly in love with her, and they had already decided to get married. He was a changed man. At the time, I was convinced that he was already an alcoholic. One thing I'm sure about to this day is that he could never have changed his life on his own. But not only did he stop drinking and gambling, he also stopped smoking. He had to pay off his debts and then start saving for a mortgage. Rows, arguments, quarrels couldn't change him. Neither could warnings or threats. Reason, appealing to his better nature, pleading for consideration for his mother, they were all a waste of time. In the end, only one thing burst through: love. The love of this 4'8", 7.5 stone Korean nurse, Nina. Peter paused, aimlessly staring into space for a few moments. He had been speaking colourfully and with a fluency that made him easy to listen to. He was a natural raconteur, though oblivious of his ability to captivate his listener. I was fascinated, he said, by the tremendous power of love in action. No power on earth could have done anything for my cousin. It helped me to realize that if I could only somehow place myself in the way of God's love, put myself under the influence of his creative power, then, like John, I too might be radically and permanently changed for the better. When I began to read the New Testament in earnest, Peter continued, I saw that this is what it was saying time and time again. I was staggered to realize that I'd never noticed it before. I'd missed the wood for the trees. Everything suddenly began to make sense. The pieces of the jigsaw began to fall into place once I had discovered the central piece. The story of Jesus Christ is a unique and world-shaking example of what happens to a person who dares to expose themselves totally to God's love. It is the story of how he was gradually possessed by that love, and the effect that this love had on his life and on the life of others. Once love of this force and magnitude invaded the life of Jesus, it enabled him not only to listen to people and care for them, but also to enter into them, to heal and cure them, restore them to wholeness, and even raise them from the dead, for there is nothing that can resist the power of uncreated love, not even death. Peter leaned forward on the edge of his seat, his shoulders slightly hunched, his right elbows resting on the arm of the easy-chair, and he continued, The more I tried to steep myself in the Scriptures, in the writings of the Fathers of the Church, in the most ancient and hallowed traditions of Christian spirituality, then the more clearly I came to see that the message was always the same. The burning question is not firstly, how do we love God, but how do we welcome God's love into our lives? How do we best position ourselves to be the recipients of that love? Once we get this right, then everything else falls into place, as it did for John. The trouble is we've presented Jesus Christ as a sort of moral philosopher, like Socrates, who primarily came to present us with the virtues with which we should adorn ourselves in order to become fully human. But Jesus was firstly a mystic, not a moral philosopher. He didn't primarily come to detail the way we ought to love our neighbor. He came to give us the power to do it. No moral teaching, however well-reasoned, however lofty, however sublime, will ever permanently change a person for the better. But love can. God's love certainly will, if we only give it a chance. The trouble is, many of us have been brought up like Stoics, or at least to believe that we should be Stoics, called to do for ourselves by our own endeavor alone what only God can do. Peter had made his point. He closed his mouth tightly, leaned back, joined his huge hands together, and unceremoniously cracked all his fingers together. I think it's time for lunch, he said. So we made our way into the presbytery. I would have to wait to ask the very many questions that were buzzing around in my head like a hive of bees. It began to rain after lunch, so we sat around the kitchen table with a third cup of tea. I started the ball rolling by asking Peter what he meant by saying that many of us are in practice Stoics. "Well," said Peter, "thanks to the Renaissance and the classical education that it introduced into our schools, the moral philosophy of the Greco-Roman Stoicism was taught side by side with Christian moral teaching, and many have found this confusing. When teenagers are just beginning to find their own identity, they prefer to believe that they can change themselves rather than ask someone else to do it for them. They are natural Stoics, and they grow up Stoics, even though they may not even know what the word means. What I mean to say is, they think they can change themselves and direct the course of their spiritual growth by dint of their own muscle power and dogged endurance. But they can't, at least not for long. The trouble is we have been brought up as Stoics, thanks to the Renaissance, with a completely one-sided view of heroism. In storybooks, adventure novels, in every kind of fiction, and even in true life stories, the hero or the heroine, they're always presented in the same way. They are the lonely, intrepid pioneers, explorers, or adventurers who dream dreams and have visions. By taking themselves by the scruff of the neck, they squeeze out every reserve of energy they possess to make their dreams come true and transform their visions into reality. Now, this may very well work in paperbacks, and it may sometimes work in real life, but it will never work in the spiritual life. But no matter what you say or how many times you say it, we've all been tarred with the same brush. We all think that we can do it ourselves and change ourselves into the persons we wish to become, at least in our dreams. Peter laughed when I told him some of the spiritual gymnastics of my first fervour, as I assiduously tried to make myself into the saint of my dreams. He told me he did exactly the same when he was at school. Apparently he'd written to a Carmelite to ask if he could purchase a hair shirt. The friar wrote back to explain that he would be delighted to accede to his commendable request. But according to ancient monastic tradition, hair shirts were always woven from the full head of hair of the wearer, hence the tonsure. So would he please forward his scalp by return of post? We laughed at the Carmelite's sense of humour. Peter plainly enjoyed a joke, and wasn't ashamed to laugh loudest of all at his own. "But do you see what I mean?" Peter said, as our laughter died down. He was in earnest again. "We all think we can do it ourselves. People still do." The intervening years might well have been a school of wisdom for Peter, but I had still not learnt my lessons. I was only beginning to see my mistakes. So I asked Peter, what else could I have done? What should I do now? Peter replied that the only thing to do is to swallow our pride and accept the truth that we can't do anything by ourselves. He said that the gospel says loud and clear, time and time again, I know you can't, but I can, if you only let me. I said to Peter that this all sounded a bit too like quietism to me. It almost gives the impression that all we have to do is to sit around all day like spiritual layabouts, waiting for God to do everything. Peter replied without hesitation, "Not at all. You go and tell a hard-working farmer that he's a layabout when he's been spending weeks breaking up the ground, digging in fertilizer, ploughing it over and over to prepare the soil for the seed. He'll probably give you a black eye. If he gets a good harvest, he can be sure of two things. Firstly, that it had nothing to do with him, and secondly, that it had everything to do with him. In other words, The tiny seed is self-contained. It nurtures within itself the inner dynamism that will produce the fine crop of oats, the field of barley, the full ear of corn. But without the labour, the toil, the spade work of the farmer, there'd be no harvest at all. Now, said Peter, preparing to press the analogy home to avoid any misunderstanding, God's love will automatically grow and develop in us like a seed. It will ultimately extend to every part of our being until it completely possesses us. And this will happen infallibly. If we only prepare the ground, remove all the obstacles required of us to facilitate the full growth of his love within our innermost being. When I asked Peter what I must do next, he answered without hesitation. The answer to that is simple: by turning back to prayer, because it is only in prayer that we come into contact with the love of God and begin to experience it entering into our lives. Nobody can experience being loved and remain the same. However, in all forms of love, the love of another can only be fully received in the act of returning their love in kind. In returning God's love, our love for him grows and deepens and enables his love to suffuse and surcharge our weak human love with his until they become as one. Now, this new supernatural fusion of loving raises us up, enabling us to be taken up and into Christ's mystical body, and then into his own personal loving of God the Father, into his mystical contemplation. Sorry to interrupt you, I said suddenly, but this word mystical, I'm afraid I'm getting a bit confused. The word mystical comes from a Greek word, Peter said. It simply means hidden, unseen or invisible. So after his ascension into heaven, Christ's glorified body could not be seen anymore, nor for that matter could he be seen at prayer, contemplating his Father. That is why we speak about his mystical body and his mystical contemplation, and how we, through entering into him, through love, can eventually share in this mystical contemplation. And so, as I said the other day, this is indeed for all, not just for a chosen few, because it is the only way to union with God. There is no other way. Gradually then, as we are purified of all that prevents us being united with Christ's mystical contemplation, something sensational happens. We begin to experience the fruits of contemplation and to share them with others in our life as Christ did in his life. But what about me, I asked. I've known for the past 20 years that God loves me, but I've not changed. I'm just the same old me. I couldn't help saying it with a touch of bitterness, and I think Peter noticed. But, said Peter, there's all the difference in the world between knowing that you are loved and experiencing being loved. Knowledge alone is not enough. Knowledge will never change anyone decisively and permanently for the better. But the experience of being loved will, if the experience is deep enough and lasting enough. Peter suddenly rose to his feet. Please do excuse me, James, but I simply must go. But of course, I stammered. I looked at my watch. It was almost 4 o'clock. I asked Peter if he would like another cup of tea, in a vain attempt to detain him. No thanks, James, Peter said decisively. I'm afraid I must go. You will come again tomorrow? I asked insistently. But of course, Peter replied, slightly surprised at the note of anxiety in my voice. Peter was unaware that the matter had ever been in doubt. If it had, it was no longer. I knew now and I knew for certain that I had indeed met the man who was going to change my life, and change it permanently for the better. And this time I was not mistaken.